Retro technology of all kinds can have its share of problems. Time alone can be enough to render a device unusable, but sometimes failures can be caused by accidents. And it seems like I've made a major mistake with one of my most valuable vintage computers. In 2022, I picked up a Daystar Genesis MP. It's a Mac clone that was released in 1995 and turned heads for two reasons. Not just that it was one of the first entries in Apple's then-new macOS licensing program, but also that it was an absolute bruiser of a machine. It came with 4 PowerPC CPUs, at a time when Apple's own computers only shipped with 1. The Genesis was, perhaps unsurprisingly, a very expensive computer at the time. This particular one would have gone for about $14,000 US at launch, and primarily catered to the graphic design and video editing markets. As such, not many were sold, and these days it's a highly desirable machine among vintage Mac collectors. Genesis MPs just don't show up for sale very often. Be sure to check out the episode I made on this machine, as it has quite the interesting story to tell. During the process of filming that one, I pulled out the CPU card and removed the heatsink in order to show off the machine's 4 PowerPC 604E processors. I applied new thermal paste when I was done and reassembled the computer. It seemed to work fine, but then I ran across a problem. This part is very important to the story. When I bought the machine, I was told that occasionally it wouldn't boot. The system would power on, but that's it, with no startup chime or video. The trick apparently was to simply reseat the CPU card. So when it happened to me, I did just that, and the machine worked again. But the second time it occurred, I wasn't so lucky. Reseating the card did nothing, and other things I tried, like cleaning its edge connector and even installing another brand new PRAM battery, made no difference. I put the Genesis back into storage, deciding to save the problem for another day, and hoping it was something simple. Sometime later, I realized I needed to finally deal with it. To keep from damaging the plastic front panel on the machine, I removed it and set it aside. Thankfully, Daystar made this easy by including metal tabs that it snaps on with. I also popped the drive bezels off, which were attached the same way, but had to break out a long, flexible screwdriver in order to remove the piece at the top with the power button. I set the machine on its side to see if the problem still existed. And it did. So I powered it off and tried removing these 2 weirdly big RAM modules, but that didn't make a difference. I tried resetting the power management chip, called the CUDA, by unplugging the power and holding this button for a few seconds. But again, no change. My attention turned to the CPU. Reseating it wasn't helping anymore, so I pulled it out and decided to try this in its place, a G3 upgrade card made by Sonnet Technologies. I've used it in other systems, so I know it works. And sure enough, the Genesis chimed and booted without a problem. Without the correct drivers installed, it wasn't running at the right clock speed, but it was at least being recognized, and the system seemed stable. I put the original quad CPU card back in just to satisfy my curiosity, and once again, the Genesis refused to boot. So that's a strong indication that the problem is with the card itself. I removed it from its brackets so I could take a closer look, and something that caught my eye is the PCB. Pressure from the big heatsink seemed to be causing it to warp a bit, and I wondered if maybe that was a factor. First though, I wanted to thoroughly clean the board. The heatsink is held on with 4 screws, along with spring clips next to each CPU. Once those were popped loose, I could lift the heatsink away. Looks like my previous thermal paste application was good, not too little and not too much. I put the card in a plastic bin and gave it a good soak in isopropyl alcohol. If there was anything like bits of the original thermal paste stuck under the CPUs, this would dissolve it and generally make it easier for me to inspect for problems. I let it soak for a couple of hours after gently scrubbing off the paste I'd applied earlier. I wish I had an ultrasonic cleaner big enough for parts like this, but I don't really have the space to store one, so soaking parts for a while will have to suffice. I let the board dry for several more hours, then to avoid wasting more thermal paste, I decided to apply some pieces of thin thermal pad. My gut said that just cleaning the CPU card alone wouldn't be enough, and that I'd be installing and removing the heatsink several times as I investigated the problem. With the card back in the machine, I powered it on, and like I suspected, it still wasn't booting. My thoughts now turned to how the board would warp under the pressure from the heatsink, and I wondered if perhaps one or more of the legs on the CPUs had developed cracked solder joints. So I put the board under the microscope and applied flux around the processors, then carefully reflowed all of their legs. Despite this, the Genesis still didn't want to boot with the exact same symptoms as before. I was wondering if maybe there was some strange problem that only affected cards with multiple CPUs, so I dug out the dual processor card from my PowerMac 9500. This one also has PowerPC 604E CPUs, but they're clocked higher at 180 MHz instead of the Genesis MP's 132. And with it installed, the clone worked fine. There was a warning in the Daystar software that said one of the two CPUs wasn't working correctly, but I suspected this was a software issue, and it did detect that it was a dual processor card to begin with. The quad CPU card requires an auxiliary power connector, so I wondered if maybe there was a power supply issue at play here. But testing it with my multimeter showed just under 3.5 volts, right in line with what the service manual says is normal. There was a small possibility it could still be a weird motherboard problem, so I wanted to exhaust those options next. I pulled the CPU and all the PCI cards out of the system, and this note on one of the slot covers made me a bit suspicious. The card support bracket came out next, followed by all the cables and wiring connected to the board. Then, with the screws removed, I was able to wrestle it out of the case. Conveniently, when I bought the Genesis, it came with a spare motherboard. I'm not sure if it's from a different system or the original out of this one, but I figured it would be worth a shot. One thing I needed to do first was replace a capacitor that had gotten damaged. This is pretty much the only time you'll see me use flush cutters to remove a cap, but once it was snipped free, I could desolder what remained of the legs and put a new one in its place. I realized there was another problem though. These boards could have their ROM chips either on a card or soldered directly. The spare one had an empty ROM slot, but also had empty pads where the chips could alternatively be installed. Without either of these, the computer wouldn't work. The board I pulled from the machine had them soldered in place, and I really didn't want to risk trying to transplant them. I dug through my parts bin and found a ROM sim, but it was labeled as being from a power computing machine, which was the most prolific of the Mac clone manufacturers in the 90s. After transferring the RAM, I installed the ROM sim since it was worth a shot. But with the board back in the case, the Genesis still didn't boot. But that was true regardless of which CPU I put in, so this time I think the ROM either wasn't compatible or this spare board had serious issues of its own. So it came out again, and I took another look at the original motherboard. While I didn't see any signs of leakage, something I probably needed to try anyway was replacing all the electrolytic caps. This board had a ton of them, 38 in total, so it was a bit of a grind getting all the old ones removed, cleaning up their solder pads, and putting new ones in their place. I went with electrolytic caps again simply because that's what I already had on hand, though I've been slowly switching over to tantalum parts if for no other reason than because they're a bit easier to work with. But with the recap finished, surely that would get the machine working with its original CPU card again, right? Nope, which really didn't surprise me. The problem is clearly with the processor board itself, and I proceeded to pore over it under the microscope again, looking for anything that could be wrong. I gently nudged every pin on each CPU, over 1,200 in total, to make sure it was soldered to the PCB, and also checked for any shorts. But I just couldn't find anything visually wrong here. There appear to be a pair of programming or debugging ports on the card, but I couldn't find any details on how to use them. And that's the kind of info Daystar wouldn't have published anyway. So I had to go with the next best option, that dual CPU card that I knew worked. I didn't like how it put stress on the motherboard's processor slot, so I designed and 3D printed a bracket to support it. To put threads in the standoff, I simply heated the screw with my soldering iron and melted it into place. Then, once it cooled, I could unscrew it. There are likely very few, if any, other people out there that could use this, but I've made the design file available anyway. The link is in the video description. I didn't want to alter the contents of the original drive, so I dropped in a blue SCSI with a fresh installation of macOS 8.5. And in 2 places it said the dual CPU card was working properly, both Apple System Profiler as well as the newer technology Clockometer program. I don't think the motherboard has ever been the problem with this machine. As for the original quad CPU card, I just don't know what to think. I've spent dozens of hours troubleshooting and inspecting it with very little to show. My best guess is that one of the CPUs has failed, due to the way the classic macOS handled multiprocessing, or rather how it didn't. The computer performs all operations on a single processor unless an application is written to take advantage of the rest. If the primary CPU happens to be the one that's dead, then I could definitely see how the system would fail to boot at all, since it can't just use another one instead. That whole business about reseating the card to get it working again could have been enough to temporarily fix a dodgy internal connection within the CPU, or it could have been a red herring all along. Regardless, the fact is that the computer did work, albeit with the occasional hiccup, before I pulled the CPU out for the first time when filming that previous video. Whether I did something to kill the card, or if it was about to fail on its own anyway, probably doesn't matter at this point. I feel awful about the situation, and I'm definitely going to start thinking a lot harder about taking apart rare vintage tech unless there's a clear need to do so. And what's probably the biggest bummer for me is that the quad processor card is really what makes the Genesis MP unique to begin with. It's the only Mac clone to offer that configuration. Without it, the machine is really just a bigger, heavier Power Mac 9500. Literally, the motherboard in the Genesis is almost exactly the same as the 9500s. And finding a replacement CPU is pretty much an impossible task, since the Genesis MP is a rare enough machine on its own, and also that a lot of owners dropped in G3 cards in the late 90s as a way to extend their usefulness. Those original CPUs, more often than not, ended up getting lost over time. That's apparently even what happened with this machine. The print shop my friend picked it up from had long since gotten rid of the original processor board after installing a G3 upgrade, and it was only by a stroke of luck that he managed to find another one. Maybe someday someone can resurrect this thing, but as it stands, it's far beyond my capabilities. In the meantime, this Genesis MP will live on with half as many processors. but given how underutilized they were to begin with, this should be more than good enough. If you liked the video, I'd appreciate a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. Please consider supporting my work over on Patreon, and as always, thanks for watching.